say the last child born on Lawson Hill never cried. Not once. The midwife claimed the baby's lungs were fine, its body warm, its heart beating steady, but not a single sound escaped its lips in the 3 days it lived. She swore it just stared, unblinking, at the shadows in the rafters, like it recognized something there. When she told this to the sheriff, he told her to stop talking, or she'd end up like the rest of them. In that county, silence wasn't just expected, it was survival. The story began, as most terrible ones do, in a place that outsiders didn't visit twice. The town didn't appear on most maps, and the roads that led there were little more than dirt veins winding into the Appalachian hills, ending at sagging farmhouses whose paint had long surrendered to the weather. It was in one of these homes, the Lawson homestead, that something unholy had been quietly passed from one generation to the next. Not a curse exactly, but a tradition no one outside the bloodline was ever meant to witness. The Lawson family had been on that hill since the late 1800s, descended from two brothers who each brought a wife and then traded them between households when the first children came of age. That arrangement, according to old family journals found years later in a rotting cedar chest, was not scandal but strategy. It kept the line pure, as one entry read in neat ink. For decades, this pattern repeated itself, fathers sharing wives with their sons, brothers raising children whose parentage no one could fully trace without a ledger and a tolerance for horror. In 1949, a girl named Ada Lawson was born into this world without ever knowing anything else existed. She was raised in the big farmhouse at the top of the ridge, where the family rules were laid out not in conversation, but in example. Women served, men took, and outsiders weren't welcome. By the time Ada turned 14, she was tall and thin, with pale skin that burned in minutes under the sun and hair the same brittle straw color as her mother's. Her only education came from her grandfather's Bible and her mother's whispered lessons about how to keep a man happy. It was at 14 that Ada was told she would be married, not to a boy her age, but to her mother's husband. To Ada, the idea wasn't strange. In Lawson Hill's way of thinking, a man could love more than one woman so long as both belonged to the same bloodline. The wedding was small. No preacher, no paper, just a supper in the big kitchen, Ada in a white dress that had belonged to her mother, and a silent understanding among the gathered men that another branch of the Lawson vine had looped back on itself. The years that followed blurred together. Ada's first child came before she turned 16. It was a girl, pale and quiet, with hair as thin as cobweb and eyes that never quite focused. Her second child was born the next year, a boy who struggled to breathe and lived only a week. Each pregnancy was followed by another, the father always the same man, her husband, who was also her mother's husband. Sometimes, when her mother was too tired, Ada would take her place in the big bed without complaint. Other times, Ada would wake in the night to find her mother already there beside him. Neighbors, the few that lived close enough to hear, began whispering about the Lawson children. Some walked with strange, lurching steps, others never learned to speak, and a few seemed to age faster than they should, faces lined by the time they reached their teens. But no one said anything openly. The Lawsons were feared. They owned most of the ridge, carried shotguns to town, and had a reputation for making trouble disappear when it came sniffing too close. The truth began to slip only when an outsider came to the ridge, a young county nurse named Evelyn Carter. She'd been sent as part of a rural health initiative in the mid-1960s, tasked with checking on expectant mothers and newborns in remote areas. When she arrived at the Lawson homestead, the first thing she noticed was the smell, not just the earthy scent of wood smoke and livestock, but something sharper, almost metallic, that clung to the air inside the house. In the front room, she saw children sitting on the floor, silent and still as dolls, their wide, pale eyes following her as she passed. In the kitchen, Ada stood barefoot, belly swollen, while her mother, also visibly pregnant, stirred a pot on the stove. Evelyn thought it was a trick of the light, but as the two women moved, their resemblance was undeniable. The same narrow jaw, the same high forehead, the same eerie stillness in their movements. It was like looking at the same person in two different stages of life. When Evelyn asked who the father was, both women answered in unison, "Our husband." The words were spoken calmly, almost proudly. Evelyn didn't know what to say. She took her notes, measured their bellies, and left the house as quickly as she could. That night, she wrote a letter to her supervisor describing the unusual living arrangements and her concerns for the children's health. She never received a reply. A month later, Ada gave birth to twins, both boys, both with severe deformities. One had a jaw so small he couldn't close his mouth. The other's eyes were clouded white from birth. The midwife who delivered them told no one, not even her husband. She knew better. But she did keep a single scrap of evidence. A Polaroid taken when Ada wasn't looking, showing the twins lying side by side in a wooden crib, their tiny hands gripping each other's. That photograph wouldn't surface for another 30 years, when it was found tucked inside a hollow wall during renovations to the old Lawson house. By then, most of the family was gone, buried on the ridge, their graves marked only by rough stones and the occasional scrap of rusted metal. But the story they left behind, and the children who had once stared silently at strangers, remain like a shadow over the town, unspoken but never forgotten. And somewhere in those hills, locals say, there's still a room in an abandoned house where the walls are covered in drawings. Not just childish scribbles, but portraits, over and over, of three faces: a man, a young woman, and an older woman. Always together, always smiling. By the time the state finally came knocking on Lawson Hill, Ada had already buried 4 children. No doctor had signed their death certificates, and no cemetery records existed. The bodies lay in the family plot at the edge of the property, marked only by hand-carved stones, their names etched in uneven letters that rain was slowly wearing away. It was 1971 when the first real investigation began, not because of moral outrage or neighborly concern, but because of a clerical error. A new clerk in the county health department noticed that 2 women at the same address had registered births only weeks apart. Both listed the same man as the father. At first, she assumed it was a mistake, but when she tried to correct it, she was told by an older coworker to leave Lawson Hill alone. The warning only made her dig deeper. Within a month, 2 plainclothes social workers were sent up the ridge. They expected poverty, maybe neglect, but nothing prepared them for the truth. The Lawson house was falling apart, warped floorboards, sagging
Subscribe to
ceilings,
my channel.
wallpaper peeling like old skin. Yet inside, there was an unsettling order. Everything smelled of wood smoke and boiled meat. Children of all ages moved silently through the rooms, their eyes tracking the strangers, but never speaking. When the social workers asked to see birth records, Ada's mother, Clara, smiled without warmth. "We keep our own records," she said, leading them to a locked wooden trunk in the bedroom. Inside were dozens of handwritten notebooks, each carefully cataloging births, deaths, and pairings, which man had fathered which child, which women had shared which husband, and in what order. The pages didn't just confirm the rumors of inbreeding. They revealed a breeding plan so deliberate it read more like livestock management than family history. What shocked the investigators most was that the arrangement wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated within the family. Ada, now in her mid-20s, but looking much older, spoke with quiet pride about keeping the line clean. She referred to her mother not as competition, but as partner, explaining that sharing a husband meant their children were true kin, doubled in spirit. The state's official report described the children's conditions in clinical, detached language: microcephaly, congenital cataracts, limb deformities, severe cognitive impairment. But the photographs told a different story. Faces that looked eerily alike, smiles that never quite reached the eyes, and an uncanny sameness that blurred where one generation ended and the next began. Yet, despite the disturbing evidence, the case stalled almost immediately. The sheriff refused to enforce removal orders, claiming the family keeps to themselves and that taking the children would do more harm than good. Behind closed doors, it was understood that the Lawsons had friends in powerful places, old family ties that ran deep in county politics. The real break came from an unexpected source. Evelyn Carter, the nurse who had first visited the Lawson home years earlier. She still remembered the silence of those children, the way they stared through her instead of at her. When she heard about the investigation, she volunteered her notes and even produced the Polaroid of Ada's twin boys. Her testimony painted a picture so grotesque that the state had no choice but to act. In 1972, a convoy of unmarked cars drove up Lawson Hill. By the end of the day, 7 children were taken into state custody. The youngest was barely 2 months old. The oldest was a boy of 12 who could not speak a word. Ada stood on the porch as they were loaded into cars, her face expressionless. Clara sat beside her, holding Ada's hand. Neither woman cried. The children were scattered to foster homes across the state, but most did not adapt. Some ran away. Others were institutionalized. One died within a year of pneumonia. Their medical records became part of a sealed file labeled Lawson case, restricted from public access for 50 years. As for Ada and Clara, they remained in the old farmhouse. The state never charged them with a crime. Locals say the women continued to share the same husband, though by then he was a frail, hollow-eyed man who rarely left his bed. He died in 1975, and the women buried him behind the house without a funeral. In the years that followed, rumors spread about strange sightings in the woods around Lawson Hill, pale figures moving at dusk, the faint sound of children's laughter with no children in sight. Hunters claimed to find fresh footprints where no one should be walking. Teenagers dared each other to visit the abandoned farmhouse, only to come back with stories of hearing soft singing from upstairs, though the house was empty. When the property was finally condemned in the late 1990s, workers discovered something the investigators had missed decades earlier: a hidden room behind the upstairs bedroom. Inside, the walls were covered in hundreds of hand-drawn portraits, the same 3 faces repeated over and over. A man, a young woman, an older woman. In each drawing, the 3 stood together, smiling. The sketches were taken as evidence, but they never made it into the public record. The room was sealed, and the house was left to rot. By the time it finally collapsed under its own weight, the Lawsons had become more legend than history, a whispered warning told to outsiders who wandered too far up the ridge. But the sealed files from the Lawson case are due to be unclassified in 2025. When that happens, the public will see what the state saw: the photographs, the medical reports, and the evidence of a family whose bloodline was folded so tightly in on itself that it became something else entirely. Something the Lawsons considered perfect. Something no one else could understand. And maybe then, the story of Lawson Hill will stop being just a ghost tale told around campfires and become the cautionary truth it always was.